So sometimes even when you do patch, it becomes a real big problem. And with the recent Microsoft patches, we now have a total meltdown.
So John, I heard you've done some extensive research on total meltdown. Can you tell us about that?
So we're all pretty familiar with the Meltdown exploit from, I guess it was probably sometime last year. And that was a vulnerability that kind of got down to the core of the processor and how operating systems executed instructions in there. Back in April, Microsoft released some patches to address the Meltdown vulnerability. But as a side effect, they actually introduced a newer vulnerability, and they're calling that this one the total meltdown vulnerability. Unlike the original Meltdown, which just allowed you to kind of arbitrarily read pages in memory that you shouldn't be able to read, this one allows you to write to them as well. But it's only really leverageable if you have applied some of these patches that were released by Microsoft to address that original Meltdown vulnerability. The important thing about this one is that a proof of concept exploit has been released in the wild now. A person known as XPN, a blog post recently, and they also posted up to GitHub the source code to leverage that exploit.
So the original Meltdown, there were known exploits, right? But there were no known exploits for this total meltdown, the follow-on, is that right?
As far as I'm aware, there wasn't any like exploits in the wild for the total meltdown, which is the exploits introduced as a result of Microsoft's kind of botched attempt to patch the original vulnerability. So when he did his proof of concept exploit code, one of the things he was kind of gearing towards there is some privilege escalation, which is what you'd want to do. If you're running at user level, I want to be able to write to something in memory that's going to allow me to execute my local privileges to administrators so that I have, full administrative capability over the machine. So interesting article about this, something that people should take a look at, especially if you want to assess whether you have any of these intermediary patches that were released by Microsoft on your machine.
So there were another set of patches released. The complexity here is that you need to patch in the right order.
They actually released an out-of-cycle patch to address this vulnerability, which had a CVE number of 2018-1038, I believe, which is a Windows kernel elevation of privilege issue. And the knowledge base article, that 409-3108, is a manual download. It's a manual security-only download that you've got to pull down and apply that in advance of patching. That's actually to help mitigate against a couple of other issues that patching causes. So there really is a lot to kind of dig into here when you start patching things, and it's definitely recommended that you try the patches in a lab environment on non-sensitive machines first prior to moving out to a wider distribution, just in case there are any impacts.
Yeah, I think I saw a similar issue with an Oracle patch, where an Oracle patch released a vulnerability. Do you think, in general, these companies are rushing to put patches out and are more, we're kind of introducing risk because maybe they're rushing to fix one issue but not putting the same rigor into that patch code that they might into a full release?
For me personally, I think that while there might be some of that, I think more it just speaks to the complexity of the technical solutions that we've built as an industry, where it's very difficult to make a change inside of something to address one problem and have a holistic view end-to-end of what the consequences of that might be.
And I would say I think the speed to delivery wholly depends on how much it's actually being exploited in the wild. So if they know that this is something that's being exploited and causing a lot of problems in the ecosystem of whatever their operating system is or their environment, I think they're more quick to get a patch and rush it out, maybe without as much system testing and due diligence as they need to do, only because there's a real immediate and pressing need because it's being actively exploited. But I don't know that that's the case here with this one, but Meltdown, Meltdown in general was a very complicated problem to deal with.
If you happen to be in this situation, just make sure you follow instructions on which Microsoft patch to put in and get them in the right sequence, and then I think you should be okay moving forward.